So if you want to read up on the sort of cultural curriculum of meat consumption, these are good books to go to. And I know you guys have so much time to read. So for next year, you'll definitely have these down. And so this is the overview of what I'll be going through. First, I'll be talking about culture and consumption in modern consumer society. Then about anthropocentrism. It pops up every now and then in different presentations. And then the role of meat consumption within Western anthropocentrism. And then how to sort of address this with a possible remedy. And just a little sort of warning, I think it was last week I took this online test where it says, which kind of presenter are you? So like the energetic entertainer or the introvert academic. And I got, like the slide spammer. So just that it might take a while, but I'm trying to cut down. And then I brought a little bit of bonus info for you guys. Who's the real supervillain in the sort of Western society? Because we like to have a villain, you know? And I brought a few favorite examples. You know these guys. It's Putin over there on his bear. I think people, they trash a lot this guy's Twitter profile, but that's because they haven't seen this guy's. And so these are some of the favorite villains, but I'm actually here to tell you that the truth is far more horrifying. And I'll get back to that in a second, but this is the real guy you need to look out for. So my main interest, main sort of wonder when I looked into my thesis and what got me thinking. Do you know Impossible Burger? Yeah, exactly. So they made this burger, put a lot of R&D in it, and they made it so it bleeds. They took non-heme iron, which is basically the same hemoglobin that is in blood. So it gives it this metallic taste, very umami, all these kinds of things. It actually bleeds, this plant burger. It's from plant blood, so it's 100% vegan. But my main wonder was like, if you have a burger like that, you fry it, and you have a burger like that, a regular beef burger, and you present it to people without telling them. And one person would eat both of them, and like a regular person who eats meat, and they would like couldn't taste the difference. But then if you told them, like this is actually a plant burger, it's better for the environment, more cost efficient, all that, they would still choose to eat the other one for some reasons. Usually they would do that, and it's like, why? We have all these rational reasons. So it's like there's this sort of ideological, cultural residue when they know it, right? And so I was telling a friend about this, like, okay, so it's, picture this, it's kind of like you have bitter, sweet, salt and sour, and then you have the fifth taste, that's umami, and culture, it's like the sixth taste. And he looked at me and said, like, yeah, it's a good point, but you took it too far. But so I'll let you guys decide after the presentation. But taking a step back and sort of looking at it from a philosophical lens, as she asked Martha, why does such an oddity like fake meat exist at all? Like we don't concoct or make fake nuts for people who have allergies, right? So people who have nut allergies, they can't eat the same kind of food that other people can. So the question, or the answer to this question actually comes from one of the other authors. He says, the range of soy-based meat analogs and other substitutes today available testifies to the centrality of the concept of meat, not to its dispensability. You know, so it's kind of like a cultural complement to the status of meat that we actually have it there. So my sort of research question for my thesis was the following. So when Pat Brown, who founded Impossible Foods, and he's a bioengineer, biochemist, he says that he's been looking for the molecule that makes meat meat. You know, what is it that makes it? And he found heme. It's like, this is it. It's umami. It's metallic taste. It bleeds. This has got to be it. But I'm sort of arguing that he should be looking for the cultural component. And so maybe it's really a question of metaphysics. So that might be what makes meat meat, in a sense. And so these are some of the reasons that people eat meat, they say. And these taste, texture, affordability, and availability. A lot of the companies that I was looking into and interviewing said these are the basic parameters that they go for. Taste, of course, make it nice and good tasting, and texture, so people don't feel like they're missing out. Make it affordable, of course, and available. Those are standard marketing parameters. But as you can see from the pie chart that I made myself, it proves my point exactly, that actually culture plays a huge part, you know? And it's, don't just take my word for it, but Martha also said There are biological reasons why people find meat so appealing, not appalling. But the cultural parts are more powerful, so to speak. When she talks about biological reasons, she means, like, historically, whenever you come across a cadaver way back in the desert, hunter-gatherer style, it was nutrient dense, you get a lot of food there, our brains grew and all that, so we're sort of biologically tuned into it. So this is not why we need to eat it more. We get so many foods we can import from all the world, but it still sort of stays with us. But she says that the cultural parts are actually more powerful. And if you ever wonder, like, does culture actually play a part? You can ponder this. This was a Danish professor who said, the Danes feel the same way about their meat that Americans feel about their guns. I think this is probably, it was a Danish professor, but I think a lot of you guys can relate. I think you could even say that the Americans feel the same way about the meat as they feel about their guns. So, and if you ever think about going into anti-gun lobbying in the States, I think you'd encounter some of the same sort of cultural mechanisms that we encounter. And so, to start out with, culture, and as Grant McCracken from the 4th book there, he says, by culture he means the ideas and activities that we construct and construe our sort of social world around us. And another way of putting it, when you take it in the sort of the sense of culture and consumption, culture is the prism through which people view products and make sense of their own and other people's consumer behaviors, right? And it's a concept crucial to the understanding of consumer behavior. You cannot see consumer behavior outside the concept of culture. Yes, and culture is also the accumulation of shared meanings. It's where we find our meaning, what gives meaning to the clothes we wear, the food we eat, all these kinds of things. So you cannot see it outside of this whole system. So basically, of course, we have a lot of biological needs we need to get taken care of. It actually says down here, you know, Maslow's pyramid of needs. So there's the biological needs, roof over your heads, food, sleep, water, all these kinds of things. But when we go sort of up the ladder to modern consumption, it goes way beyond just our biological needs, right? So it comes up to self-actualization, that we don't need all these fancy clothes, we just wear the same thing all the time. But we're sort of performing ourselves through this. And in a way to sum it up, societal ideals provide sort of the blueprints of what it means to be a real man, real woman, real father, a good executive, a good boss, a good employee, all these kinds of good citizens. And the consumer goods are kind of the tools or the bricks they give us to construct this with, right? So we can buy these things and perform ourselves as a real man or all this through this blueprint. Of course, we don't have to do it, but it's kind of already out there, so that's where most people go for it. And this is how we sort of construct ourselves. And there's a lot. You could go way deeper into that, but I won't bore you with it. And of course, luckily, vegans as the sort of super critical, ethical consumers are, of course, way above and beyond this, because we don't need to do shit like that. So the modern mantra of consumer society is this: I shop, therefore I am. That's how we perform ourselves. So, okay, you got that, the whole cultural consumption. But what about meat? That's what I lured you in with, right? Did you know these two memes? So I was looking at a Facebook discussion between a vegan and a not-so-vegan, and the not-so-vegan posted this to sort of troll the other one. Vegetarian is an old Indian word for lousy hunter. And then the comeback was this, like, meat eater is an old Indian phrase for lousy gardener. And hands up and hands to your heart, honestly, which one thinks this is most funny? Okay, it's a tough crowd. Okay, and which one thinks this is most funny? Okay, well, I think most people would actually agree this one over here is most funny. And I found that quite interesting because structurally, it's the same kind of joke, you know? Professional stand-up guy would say structurally, completely the same, but sort of the cultural meaning inherited, it doesn't have the same depth, right? You could actually see this guy coming home, just like only leaves and berries, and he's not gonna get, you know, the lady of the tribe, right? And this is kind of like, yeah, not so funny anyways. So there's something behind this, right? And I would argue these are actually the two sort of main ideologies at play. One is called anthropocentrism, and the other is called biocentrism. And this is basically sort of this moral hierarchy, this big pyramid that we have in Western society, and I'll get more into that. And biocentrism is one other ideology that kind of sees it in a different way. And here you have the man up there, a woman, and then different types of animals all the way down the hierarchy. And here it's more one big Hakuna Matata thing. So to sum it up, define it, anthropocentrism is the philosophical viewpoint arguing that human beings are the central and most significant entities in the world. This is a basic belief embedded in Western religions and philosophies. Anthropocentrism regards humans as separate from and superior to nature and holds that human life has intrinsic value, while other entities, including animals, plants, minerals, all that, are resources that may justifiably be exploited for the benefit of humankind. And one guy, Arthur Lovejoy, historian and philosopher, said, the great chain of being, which is also reference to anthropocentrism in this pyramid, it's one of the most pervasive and powerful assumptions in the Western society. And this brings me back to this guy, actually, because he's like the true face of anthropocentrism. So you figure you have like the devil sitting there and the angel sitting there. It's actually this guy. So to sort of get into it, you've seen the movie, right? He lands on the bed there. He encounters the sort of the natives there. And his first expression is like, oh shit, I put my laser to kill, you know? And it's a good sum up of how Western civilization has dealt with any other civilization we ever met, right? It's not like, ding dong, hey, I'm here for coffee, right? Well, we go in like, boom, 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 democracy. So this is like one way, one sort of attitude towards it, also summed up in this. It's a sort of technological domination over nature has been the main goal, the main striving point of Western civilization. As Nick points out in his book, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the ethic of human supremacy was consistently invoked to justify the steadily increasing power of industrial civilization. Conversely, the exploitation of nature tangibly exemplified and so was seen to confirm our evident difference and natural elevation. So there's a sort of performativity at work, right? Why are we above nature? Because we exploit it. Why do we exploit it? Well, we're justified in doing so because we're above it. And Western society is also sort of seen as the peak and measure of all of evolution, or God's creation, if you will. So even if after he finds out he can't actually shoot down Woody, he says, well, there's no intelligent life here anyways, you know, not compared to my standards. And this is another way of illustrating anthropocentrism. We've all seen the slide. And to sort of sum it up, each species has attributes which others lack. And it's only an anthropocentric worldview which makes qualities possessed by humans to be those by which all other species are measured, right? So we're the sort of the measuring pole of all others. And there's also sort of a blind belief in the paradigm of financial growth, you know, to infinity and beyond. Like one guy said, people who believe in infinite economic growth on a planet with finite resources is either like a madman or an economist, right? There's this sort of weird paradigm there. One way we do this is by resourcifying or making everything into a resource for us, like I mentioned. Do you know this, Ross 308? You've encountered it? I'll read it for you. The Ross 308 satisfies the demands of customers who require a bird that performs consistently well and has the versatility to meet a broad range of end product requirements. The Ross 308 produces a high number of eggs combined with good hatchability and optimized chick costs in situations where broiler performance is important. The Ross 308 is recognized globally as a broiler that will give consistent performance in the broiler house. Integrated and independent producers value the growth rate, feed efficiency, and robust performance of the 308. So it's like they kind of sells. It always feels to me like they're trying to sell me like a refrigerator or something, right? That's really high on energy efficiency and all that. So that's sort of the Western paradigm of how we approach things. It has some side benefits or other ways of how we deal with it, because men pay for their increase in power with alienation from that over which they exercise their power, right? Like these guys said. So through this, like a thin red thread through it all, is what's called the differential imperative, which is kind of like how we see ourselves as human is based on this, at least in the Western society. So what is virtuous in the human is taken to be what maximizes distance from the merely natural, right? The maintenance of sharp dichotomy and polarization is achieved by the rejection and denial of what links humans to the animal. So everything that's sort of below us, our base instinct. When you say like, oh, you're an animal yesterday because you're drunk or whatever it was, like you're acting on baser instincts, but we have to be sort of way up here, right? And so everything that's kind of relates us to the non-human world, the animal's nature, is kind of what we try to cut off, and everything that pulls us away from it is seen as like a higher end on the scale. One exception is pets, but as we saw in a good presentation yesterday, it's kind of, they're sort of humans by proxy, right? They're part of the family, someone that we will relate to. So in a sense, they're also just humans, and we kind of look down on other cultures that eat animals that we view as pets, right? Because they're almost human in a sense. And this kind of explains, you know, this graph, right? That we got 99 problems, it seems. So, no, sorry, we got 1% of all human donations going to charity, they go into animals, right? But 1% of those go into farmed animals. You know, so these guys over here, even though these are the ones that are most heavily exploited by humans. It's also a term called meowspiracy, you know, it's all cats and dogs and all that. So this concept of human exceptionalism, you usually don't find it when you ask people, so are you a human exceptionalist? Yeah. So it's actually, for most people, it's not something they think about, but this guy does. So he wrote this book, A Rat is a Pig, As a Dog is a Boy, The Human Cost of the Animal Rights Movement. It's not something you would enjoy reading. So I did, and I did not enjoy it. So it's this sort of ideology played to perfection. He says that the idea that human beings stand at the pinnacle of the moral hierarchy of life should be, and once was, uncontroversial. After all, what other species in the known history of life has attained the wondrous capacities of human beings? What other species has transcended the tooth and claw world of natural selection to the point that, at least to some degree, we now control nature instead of being controlled by it? What other species builds civilizations, record history, creates art, makes music, thinks abstractly, communicates in language, envisions and fabricates machinery, improves life through science and engineering, or explores the deeper truths found in philosophy and religion? It's kind of like a big ego boost to the collective human ego, right? So I'd actually say this is quite an important book, and I was actually going to give a challenge to you guys that like next year, because you're probably going to read a lot of animal rights book and get sort of that ideology in, but to the guy who comes up to me, or woman of course, next year and says, oh, I actually read this, I'm going to buy you guys a beer. So you can note that down. So yeah, so anthropocentrism is kind of very central to how we see ourselves as human beings, at least in the Western world. But then again, what about meat, you know? So coming back to Nick again, he says that it's not that we each consciously exult in our mastery of nature whenever we bite into a piece of flesh, but we are brought up within a culture which has regarded environmental conquest as a laudable goal and which has deployed meat as a primary means to demonstrate it. So there's sort of a performativity as well, right? How do you justify eating animals? Well, because we're above them. But how do you, like, why are we above them? Because we eat them. So it's our way of sort of performing our way up the food chain. And it's also not consciously necessarily, except in the case of the earlier quote, I guess. So another way to say it, that to the many human cultures which have established their identity apart from and above the rest of nature, the consumption of animal meat is an eminently suitable choice to represent power, achievement, prestige, civilization, basically humanity. Meat is valued partly because it is expensive to produce in terms of effort and environmental cost, not in spite of it. So sometimes when you argue, but it's so expensive to produce meat, you pour so much water into it. It's kind of like, you've seen these guys driving around this, right? Like a Hummer. And they know that it's not fuel efficient. That's not what the car salesman is pulling it off, right? It's kind of to show off, I have enough money to spend. You know, people who kind of go, you know, what's it called, champagne washing? When you go to clubs and you buy 2 bottles of champagne, you should like pour the other one out in the sink. Or as we in the sort of environmental movement like to call it, nothing's dumber than a Hummer, right? But it's still sort of in there in our culture. And have you heard about these ones? Can you read it? A bacon cheeseburger, because I didn't fight my way to the top of the food chain to become a vegetarian. Guess you've all encountered that one. Or I can't live on rabbit food because I'm a warrior. So this basically also testifies to this sort of new concept of anthropocentrism, which Nick says, this notion of the great chain of being, or anthropocentrism, is now sort of reformulated into this sort of scientific term we call the food chain, right? So I don't know if you ever notice when you tell people that you don't eat meat or eat plants, and they kind of get this feeling that you can argue with them rationally about ethics or environment, but they kind of give you this, like, dude, you're messing with the sort of the food chain. It's kind of, like Galileo, he said to way back when that Earth is not the center of the universe. People got really pissed, And what actually happens if Earth is not the center of the universe? Does like living prices go up or gravity stops working? That's the same thing that it's always been. It just messes with this sort of cosmology, this underlying ideology that we have. And this ties it in neatly with masculinity, which is part of the anthropocentric worldview as well. And this book by Carol Adams, she says that meat-eating societies, we gain male identification by eating meat, and therefore vegetables and other non-meat food are viewed as women's food, and therefore sort of inferior, lower on this hierarchy. And it's not just sort of an abstract concept for philosophers and all this. We actually encountered it in some of our work. There's a study being done. They tried to implement meat-free Mondays in the Norwegian military, and these two researchers went in and checked why it didn't go through, And they found that some of the most significant barriers preventing the implementation of meat-free Mondays was the Norwegian soldiers associated meat with protein, masculinity, and comfort. So it's an actual barrier. They went in and interviewed, and that what people sort of, but we're already soldiers, we need to eat higher up the food chain. All this, it's not really rational arguments, but it's still a huge barrier. So sort of as another type of ideology to contrast, we have biocentrism that I mentioned, and I will implore you not to Google it because you get all this hippie crap about we're like all one big entity and all that. But I would say like one good proponent of it is Peter Singer, wrote the book called The Expanding Circle, makes a brilliant argument here. Membership in the species Homo sapiens is the only criterion of moral importance that includes all humans and excludes all non-humans. He goes on further to say, using memberships in the species of Homo sapiens as a criterion of moral importance is, completely arbitrary. So, of the remaining criteria we have, it's only sentience that actually works to include all, and it's not arbitrary, because they can feel pain and all these morally relevant criteria. So, we should actually extend the sort of the basic principle of equality to other sentient creatures, right? Therefore, we include all of them in this sort of expanding circle of morality. And that's all good and well. Like, that's a really brilliant philosophy. And another way of putting it to sort of contrast with another worldview that this is a very Western concept. There's this quote from the Sioux chief, Luther Standing Bear. He said that we did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills, and the winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame, not until the hairy man from the east came, and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families we loved, was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began fleeing from his approach, that was for us when the Wild West began. So, like this way that the Western civilization has interacted with all other civilizations, he's sort of saying that we brought the Wild West. It's our concept. We came there and we saw, shit, like there's all these animals running around, all these savages in the woods. We got to plow it all down, make railroads, make it civilized, make it apart from nature. So, can't we just tell people, like, hey, that would be easy. It's kind of like, this would be the easiest form of activism, having two pills. And one is like, here, see the truth. And the other one is actually remaining in this sort of blissful ignorance. So can't we just make some sort of prison break from the matrix, right? Unfortunately, it's not that easy because there's some barriers to it. I'll get into it. One is this traditional masculinity or anthropocentrism is under pressure, and that's usually never a good thing. People don't react well. So traditional masculinity is threatened nowadays by feminism, the gay movement, metrosexuality, and all the baby björn-wearing, carrot-munching fathers of the world. Old school masculinity needs to be reaffirmed, and one way to do this is to connect it once again with eating bloody slabs of animal flesh, even if that flesh didn't require any skills or strength to kill it, and came in a plastic wrap from a supermarket. And note that this is Carol Adams again, who wrote the book in 91, stating that, okay, there's a huge issue with anthropocentrism and meat consumption and male domination and all that. But so in 2016, she's actually realized, okay, by pushing them, we're getting this pushback, you know? Like one person said that sort of the equality for the people who've been on top might feel like oppression, you know? Technically it's not oppression, but they are feeling sort of this privilege of being the only one on top. They're feeling that this is a loss. So it might cause them to be more defensive. So actually what we see is sort of a very defensive identity pattern, right? That their defenses are still up. So one study showed when people are in a sort of identity flux, when they move to another country, change nationality, have to absorb into another culture, or when they change an age category, they become adolescents or they become retired. Whenever they're sort of feeling an existential pressure, what they do is they cling more to all of these material symbols to perform their identity. So in Denmark, for example, we have an older generation, which is a bit more culturally conservative. And so when they feel the pressure of globalization and the huge immigration and all this, what they do is they cling more to the flag, you know, they kind of hold it hostage. And pork, apparently, which is a huge export in Denmark, is really important, apparently, and so is Christmas, this old heathen tradition. So they cling on to these symbols to reinforce their identity, you know, because they're feeling the winds of change blowing. So that's one of the mechanisms. Another one is that they made a study when people are shown a fact that contradicts with their own identity, something they're identified with. The same centers in the brain lights up as when they're being physically attacked or threatened, you know? So for most people, when they feel attacked or threatened, it's like they back up or they get into fight mode and they defend what they hold dear. So there's actually some issues with just sort of pushing it there. We need to do it in a different way. And as coming back to the Norwegian military study said, they concluded that in order to overcome the barriers to a meat reduction scheme, the meat-free Mondays would need to be translated into a language and to fit in with the ideology that the soldiers there would understand in some way. So one cool example of this that I heard has nothing to do with meat per se. It was this Spanish construction site where they had a huge rate of accidents. People got head trauma because they weren't wearing these helmets. So what they did this campaign where they put up a note saying 90% of all these accidents could be avoided if people would only wear a helmet. And there's no behavior change at all. So they sent it this behavioral philosopher, she called herself, I forget the name. And she realized that there's sort of this macho mood in the locker room, like, oh, come on, don't wear a helmet, you know, be a real man. And what she did with this discovery is she made this poster where you have like a real man standing with a helmet, and he's embracing his young little daughter and his wife on the side, and it says, real men can take care of themselves and can continue to support their family. And so what this did would completely flip the script, and everybody started wearing a helmet, you know, and you can almost picture the sort of locker room dialogue post this campaign, right? When this young guy comes up, come on, don't wear a helmet, you know, be a real man and live a little. And this old guy's like, you're so young and inexperienced, but actually I have responsibility towards stuff, you know, another sort of masculine value that you can emphasize. And one good example, you know, like they say, history repeats itself. So in this book, you could actually be reading about the future. It's called The Vegetarian Crusade. It's the history of our movement, basically. It's very informative and very boring. So one good example of it was in August 1860, when this movement was just coming up. This guy he was nicknamed the Vegetarian Ferryman. He did 80 hours of continuous rowing from Boston to New York. It was like 400 nautical miles. He did it on a completely plant-based diet. And it's the first time in history that the vegetarian diet was directly linked in mainstream media. Media is important, as we'll learn later on. It did a lot to legitimize the vegetarian lifestyle, which has been portrayed as for the weak and the feeble, and they didn't even know B12 back then, which was probably good, but definitely like deficient in a lot of ways, right? So now it was associated with strength, virility, and social status, and all these things that meat consumption, as I've tried to demonstrate, was and is. So this was usually how vegetarians were portrayed, right? These weak, feeble beings, right? So that was one historical example. So what I did with my thesis, actually, I told these people, when you have this burger and people will still prefer the beef burger for some reason, this is probably the reason. So what you need to do is you need to sort of connect this type of masculinity. I actually said you should make posters with them, get them to eat the Beyond Burgers and stuff. And you should connect it with Impossible Burgers, because this is sort of the symbolic property that this old school masculinity needs to be able to get the sixth taste out of their burger. And we also have it not just in the sort of branding world, but I think it was the Paris meeting 2 years ago with the climate summit. And the Meat Free Mondays was present there, and we tried to make some media noise for this. I think we made like 2 articles. And then this guy went out and said, yeah, we should eat more tofu for the planet. It was like all the rage in the media, you know, because he's a big ideal. And you can see that most of you guys are probably not even looking at this. You're looking at this, right? So it's not so much about what is being stated, but it's this guy, what he represents. You know, he's even, what's it called? Like over there, they have the liberals and the other guys, right? The conservatives, the Republicans. He's even sort of more this old school cowboy Reagan masculinity, right? And you know this guy as well, probably. He was like the world's strongest man probably still is, on a plant-based diet. And he's actually portrayed in this movie that's coming out called The Game Changers, coming out in 2018, instructed by James Cameron. And also the guy behind the movie The Cove. And they have this vegan athlete who's like an MMA fighter. And what the movie is basically about, it's they interview all these vegan athletes and their top performances and how they tune it in, you know, and how it's actually possible to build muscle on a vegan diet, you know. And sometimes, like, why do we need to go through all this? You know, like muscle. We're talking about like apocalypse, end of the earth, climate change, animal suffering. Yeah, but muscle, man. So it's, again, like, nothing's dumber than a Hummer, but still, it's something we need to address, I would at least argue. So this is my feeble attempt to sum it up. Modern consumers perform our identity through our consumption, right? We're in a consumer society. It's not like way back when everything was static. There's the king, the queen, the family were just peasants, and we stay there, right? So we have this freedom and also this obligation to consume and perform ourselves continuously through consumption. So anthropocentrism is central to the Western notion of what it means to be human beings, right? And meat consumption is a central symbol in performing our identity so that it is aligned within the sort of ideological comfort zone, right? You guys are probably way beyond the ideological comfort zone of Western anthropocentrism, and you get some heat for it every now and then. And when people feel a threat to their identity, they will close down and seek out symbols that can help them reinforce their identity. And this is a really strong point that I would like to emphasize. You cannot just push in the same sense, right? And so anthropocentrism, you can actually think of it as sort of this our Western species collective minority complex, right? That's how it functions. It's like, oh, you attack me on the size of my whatever, and I need to push back, right? And so what we should do, we should supplement our activism with appeals that sort of align with this above, you know? It's something that we cannot just go beyond the matrix. And you've seen the movie, they don't react kindly to intrusion into their ideology. And yeah, that was basically all I had. No, actually not. I was just gonna finish off with a cool pun, as some people do, but yeah, now it's kind of there. But so you've seen meat consumption is definitely on the rise. You see China's middle class, India's middle class are sort of copy-pasting the Western consumer pattern. You know, there's one person who said, like, the Cold War was finally over, this clash between ideologies, when they opened up a Burger King in Moscow, right? So, like, Western world is kind of out there. So that's what they're copy-pasting, this sort of Western ideology in some sense. So I would argue, even though our consumption of meat is going up, the sort of the real and the biggest appetite is one for meaning and one that we need to address. And thank you, that was all.
we have a lot of time for questions. Yeah.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, very insightful and very well communicated. My question is regarding the last slide about meat consumption and of course linked to emerging markets. So I guess, of course, the emerging markets would like to basically live a similar lifestyle as in Western countries. So, if you have any recommendation on how to approach our fellows, in the emerging markets, because what I found is that, of course, they really tend to idealize, people from Western countries, and also like to imitate or emulate us. So, if there's a way to kind of change their perspective and don't make them feel that if they eat meat, they are more masculine and more Western.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So what some people from the effective altruism movement have done, they've gone in and make this huge analysis of the emerging markets in Asia and this region, and how it's actually more accessible to sort of a plant-based invasion of all these meats. So Hampton Creek, fastest growing food company in the world with Hampton Creek's mayo, all these plant-based options. They're also now making clean meat. So they allied with Asia's, one of the top richest men there, to actually get there before that all these sort of carnistic defenses or whatever we call it, before they get erected, So, because they're not already there where we are, so entrenched in our own views, right? So I would argue we should actually, if it's true this, and they're sort of copy pasting Western ideology, the consumption pattern, not just the meat, because meat is inherently good or nice. It's not. It's an ideology. Then we should actually market Western values along with this. If you get some of these guys, Sylvester Stallone, sitting there eating this raw vegan burger that bleeds or whatever, that would be something. I've been trying for a while to get Arnold Schwarzenegger to eat one of these burgers at the climate summit. That would be really awesome. This guy that in one of the movies he was in with Sylvester Stallone, they're in this prison and he gets hit by him and he just turns around and says you hit like a vegetarian. So that would be really cool to get him to eat that. And I think that's kind of what we need to do along those lines. I know Odwerte Klatki, the Polish organization, they've actually done some really cool, amazing Facebook videos where they tune it in with sports stars, athletes, doing the more macho arts, martial arts, all these things. And I think that's one way of showing it, Nothing's dumber than a Hummer, so.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I don't have a question. I just have a comment on the question, or maybe a suggestion. Because in your presentation we saw very different concepts and very different terminology. And I think it's very important, at least from my perspective as an anthropologist, to really understand what we are talking about when we are talking about the needs of pyramid of Maslow, which is one concept, and then cosmology, which is completely another concept, and then masculinity, which is another thing. These are all very complex issues on themselves. But then when we were talking about the emerging markets and your suggestion about the Sylvester Stallone eating a tofu burger and things like this, of course, I don't argue of any of those things. But I think we tend to forget about also autonomy and the way of life, maybe even more than the term culture, in these communities and what politically is affecting those communities. So maybe when you were saying, I found your comment about Matrix, and you said how they didn't take it very well, the disruption of the agents. But I think this is precisely what we should do, because one Sylvester Stallone won't disrupt the Matrix. But I think people will realize their own cosmologies, like you were quoting the Native American chief. In China, we know how it was with the food, and in India, we know how it was with the food. So I think we should also allow some other, I would say more, what I would say activism, which speaks in another language, which maybe there is a question of unifying the message for all the globe. What is the answer also for the uniform cultural codes that we are trying to impose also in veganism? So why should somebody from China or India like Sylvester Stallone? What are their cultural codes and things like this? I think it's very important for us to also think in these ways. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good comment, and to the first thing you said about the many different slides and all that. Like I said, I am a slide spammer, so it's a lot of like here and there. That's kind of how my mind works. But yeah, it's a good point. So when I had the slide, and you could see culture was like part of the reasons we eat meat, and I got to decide the size of that. I actually don't know on a consumer scale like what is the actual percentage of the reason that people consume meat in terms of culture. It's very hard to determine in the same way, right? So it's just an illustration. But I would argue that it's huge. It's very hard to sort of, how to say, swim upstream in terms of society, you know? Our identity is so important to us. We need to identify it. Else we should all go Buddhist, you know, and just forget the ego and release all this tension against the world, you know, just go with the stream. But I think that's an even harder sell. I think it would be easy to just like, sell this concept to Dalai Lama, you know, go vegan, you know. But I think with a lot of Western consumers, these forces are so strong, also a lot of psychological evidence, we don't want to stand out, all this, that this is also one way of doing it. And another sort of more pedagogical point is that the one guy said about the slave trade, that it's very hard for a country and a nation to go against something that their livelihood depends upon. You know, they needed the cotton trade, all this, they had all these financial arguments. But if you take away that industry, you know, this incentive to keep up all these rationalities, and you first get them started with clean meat, which has some other ideological capabilities that I presented, than the ones I presented, and you get them started with plant-based meat, it's way easier to educate rationally afterwards, I would say, because all these defenses are not up. So I'd say this is like a good supplement in terms of it. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for your very entertaining and very interesting talk. My question is actually an observation. It's not a question. You mentioned that anthropocentrism is predominantly a Western concept or notion. So do you think it has got something to do with the religion? I come from an Eastern background, and I'm sure Eastern, like Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, they are also anthropocentric, definitely, because that's why the patriarchy still exists. You see the dominance over nature, dominance over animals still. I mean, the degree might vary about animals, especially Jainism. They are a bit compassionate, but it's still there. So what would be, according to you, that it is more dominant in Western?
Yeah, it's a really good comment. And I also mentioned... Oh, done? Yeah. So it's a really good comment, because anthropocentrism just means sort of centered on the human being, right? And wherever there's human beings, they're probably going to center on themselves. So I talked about the notion of Western anthropocentrism. It goes back to Aristotle, who said, like, had this cosmology that plants were made for the animals and animals were made for our consumption. It goes all the way up to Descartes, and he says there's this distinction between beings that have a soul and beings that don't, and that's sort of justifying beings with a soul, including gingers, that they can eat the other ones, right? So that's sort of, it's been all the way up through Western civilization, then coupled with this technological dominance. So there's other issues where I think even in the quote I had from the Sioux chief, that this is, they also had, like, they said, oh, this is like brother squirrel, and then they still cook it over a fire, right? But they have a different way. So it's a different way. But I would argue why the focus has to be on here is, like, you've seen the Highlander series, right? These guys running around through all ages, cutting their heads off, and the slogan is, there can be only one. And when you kind of look at the battles of ideologies and anthropocentrism, I think the Western one has sort of won. There's in a book by Gandhi, he's talking about his first sort of experience with meat eating. It's one of his autobiographies, I think. And as he's sort of, one of his friends is like, he was young and more angry about the oppressing forces from the UK, and he started saying, one of his friends argued, we should eat more meat to become stronger and sort of kick them out, you know? He was not talking about protein, he was talking about tapping into this sort of ideology. So Gandhi ate some meat and he regretted it. But still you could see this battle, that's just sort of an anecdote. But you also see, I think that's one of the reasons why in India and other countries it's sort of winning. You know, they're also copy-pasting clothing and other things. So it's, anthropocentrism is everywhere and it's everywhere, and it's a bias that we will have because we are humans. But I would still say that the Western one is sort of the one we should focus on. But I think in terms of implementing marketing strategies in other countries and other regions of the world, we should focus more on their celebrity type, their ideal of masculinity or whatever it is.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your talk. I love it. Love it. I wanted to know if you had any ideas, because I'm kind of like trying to infiltrate this like women's group that in the States. They are all these like holier than thou, I meditate, and like, you know what I mean? They're acting Buddhists and everything, but they're all eating meat. But they're so attached, incredibly attached, like viciously attached. Like, and if you have any recommendations, I'm just trying to figure out like what's their cultural attachment when they're trying to be like so above all this and like holy, like attached to God, you know, like if you have any recommendations how to attack that, whatever culture they are.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
I didn't
women.
bring a slide for it. So yeah, I actually sometimes call that when people do this and talk a lot about it, I call it 2D Buddhism because they don't really go into it. But it does seem like mindfulness and all this has sort of infiltrated. So one thing that actually has happened with the sort of mindfulness concept and how we use it in the West is kind of implemented in the same way that I'm arguing that we should implement meat reduction and all these other vegan products. It was called mindfulness in the 60s. Before that, it was just meditation and all this Eastern way of doing it. And now we're actually seeing it going corporate. You know, more companies are talking about what we call the attention economy. You know, our frontal lobe is the most powerful resource for us to produce for our companies. Everyone is sitting like this, working in front of a computer. Oops, you open the tab with Facebook, 5 minutes go by, an hour. So we need to discipline our neurons, and we do that through meditation, mindfulness. I don't think that's Buddha's original idea with it, but I think we kind of implement it in this way. So, and I see that there's definitely women who are more in tune with this anthropocentric worldview and climbing the top of the corporate food chain, right? They tap into more of these symbols as well. They eat more red meat in the Washington steakhouses, you know, to sort of perform. They wear this sort of masculine clothing and all that. So one way would to be using the same sort of selling point, like, okay, if this is your ideology, I don't know why they do the meditation. If they do it because it's like being one with everything, but it's also just to tap into disciplining your neurons, this kind of attention economy. That might be one way, showing them the way of compassion, but it seems like there's some sort of, it's stuck there somehow, and there's something in the cogwheels. It's hard to guess at. I don't know, we could discuss it later on afterwards if you want.
Hey there, so I have a question about your last slide here. Something obviously you've thought about a lot, so I really like your strategy that you're kind of talking about today, using the cultural values that we already have to promote reducing meat consumption and veganism. But it's clearly there's a line to toe here because you don't want to reinforce systems of oppression and toxic masculinity and you know, even you say Western imperialism, all of these things. So maybe you could talk about more specifically how how can you use these strategies of using our current cultural values while also not reinforcing these systems of oppression?
Yeah, and thank you for noticing the slide. I was like, whoa, this is going to be lynching hour, but it's apparently not. But yeah, I brought that on because I think this was definitely going to be a comment and that I would actually like to discuss because it's important. So you said how we can sort of reinforce it. One was the example that I had earlier from this construction site. I call it the gender construction site, right? Because we have a need to identify. We do that no matter what. Like that's just sort of the human nature. We could go into philosophy of mind, all that stuff. So unless we go Buddhist, we're going to have this drive to be something, you know, that we put on. I'm not even sort of wearing the suit. You know, it's wearing me in a sense, like we say. So what we could do is, like they did there, they sort of tweak masculinity. They had this abstract notion of masculinity. It doesn't really exist. It's floating up here, right? But as a male, I should identify it with it, I guess, right? So, and it went down here with a wire to don't wear a helmet. This was the action, right? And so she took it like, oh, geez, this is the main ideological fuel for this. So we take it and we hardwire it down to wear a helmet and sort of tap into positive masculine values as the defender, you know, and this responsible guy, you know, not this youth rebel without a cause kind of a thing, right? And you could actually do that. I don't know if it applies to everywhere, but it helped a lot there. And I think people like Arnold Schwarzenegger is definitely, when he goes out and say, yeah, I'm Republican, and we should save the environment, right? It's the cool thing to do. He's actually part of rewiring that process on a larger scale than a construction site. Another thing that I didn't get into is actually the millennials. You're actually seeing that a lot of them have, on some subconscious level, they care way more about environment, way more about animals, you know. Climate change is our generation's like big story, you know. It's our parents, it was like the Cold War, the Russians are coming, or if you're on the other side, it's like Reagan is coming or whatever. But someone's coming, right? So now it's climate change, and this is our ideal, and we kind of realizing that our technological dominant strategy of nature is not really working. We're getting more and more technophobic. So we're scared of culture, and we're kind of realizing, shit, we're kind of part of the problem, our attitude. So it's still growing among young consumers. You see more of them sort of quitting or cutting down on meat, which is like the central symbol of this anthropocentric worldview. So I think we're going to see it slide, but it's more to get what a lot of these companies that are interviewing wanted to do. They wanted to get to like the Texan dad who just takes his kid to a sports bar, right? It's very hard to like get him to eat carrot sticks and tofu. So you had to sort of do it in another way, with this more traditional way. So I'd say, yeah, of course we should be very aware of it. And so when I talk about the defensive of it, actually one thing I use a lot in my own life is this quote by one guy called Leo Ruskin. He says, "It is the weak who are cruel. Gentleness can only be expected from the strong." So when you think of that, and you think of the example of bullies in school or high school, the big guys that will beat all the other up and take their lunch money, you think, wow, that's power and strength and all that. But it's actually not. When you look at statistics, these people, they do worse off in grown-up life. It's this sort of acquired way of going through the world, you know, that's not very productive. They don't make it far. It's not an act of strength, quite the opposite. So whenever I encounter this, like, whoa, it's a defense mechanism. It's something we need to understand better to not trigger it and actually serve people up. They're sort of within their ideological comfort zone, and sort of use empathy and a way, empathy understood as psychological understanding of where they are, and then use that. That's like one of our biggest tools as activists. It's probably also the main reason we got into these low-paying jobs, and it's one of the best way to sort of reach out to people and connect them with their empathy. Yes, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, if you think of anything, you can get in touch with him afterwards. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much.